On a fog-draped Halloween night in Mary Mead, laughter turns to terror when a graveyard walk ends in murder, and Miss Marple uncovers secrets buried deeper than the dead. Where are you listening from tonight? It was the kind of October evening that made the little village of Mary Mead look as though it had stepped straight out of a postcard, crimson leaves tumbling across cobbled lanes, soft mist curling around the church spire, and the faint sound of laughter drifting from the village hall where the annual Halloween gathering was underway. Children darted about in costumes, ghosts, witches, and pirates, while the adults busied themselves with pumpkin pies, apple bobbing, and gossip that flowed as freely as the cider. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a neat grey shawl, sat near the edge of the hall, quietly observing the festivities. Her pale blue eyes, kind but piercing, missed nothing. Not the nervous glance exchanged between Mrs. Pembroke and the vicar's wife, nor the way young Martin Blythe seemed far too distracted by something outside the frosted window pane. To most, it was simply another cheerful autumn evening. To Miss Marple, there was a strange tension under the surface, an unspoken unease that seemed to ripple through the crowd like the chill wind outside. At the heart of the celebration stood a curious attraction: the graveyard walk, a Halloween tradition revived after nearly 20 years. The idea had been to lead guests by lantern light through the churchyard behind Street Luke's, ending at the old burial ground where the oldest graves lay. All in good fun, Mr. Pembroke, the churchwarden, had declared with enthusiasm, though his wife's tight smile suggested she was less convinced. As the procession gathered by the porch, laughter and chatter filled the night air. Lanterns swung gently, casting wavering shadows over the moss-covered headstones. The vicar, tall and absent-minded, read a few lines from a local ghost legend, the story of the Forbidden Grave, where, it was said, an unknown man had been buried after midnight many years ago, against church law. No one knew who he was, or why the grave was sealed with a thick iron cross. Superstitious nonsense, of course, the vicar chuckled. Though, he added with a nervous laugh, the stone is said to shift now and then on All Hallows' Eve. The group laughed, but Miss Marple noticed a flicker of discomfort among the villagers. Superstition, she had long believed, often hid something very human: fear, guilt, or memory. As the lanterns swayed and the group moved deeper into the graveyard, a faint mist began to rise. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled once, heavy and hollow, and then came the scream. It was sharp and sudden, a woman's voice, breaking through the laughter and chatter like glass shattering in silence. The crowd froze, lanterns swung wildly, and shadows leapt across the tombstones. "Over there, by the yew trees!" cried someone. Several men rushed ahead, Miss Marple following with measured steps, her heart calm but alert. At the edge of the old burial ground, half hidden beneath the roots of the ancient yew, lay the body of a man. His face was pale in the lantern light, his eyes open in frozen shock. His head rested inches from the iron cross that marked the forbidden grave. Gasps and whispers spread among the villagers. "Who is it? Oh, Lord, preserve us, look at him. That's Mr. Pembroke." Miss Marple lowered herself slowly, peering at the still form. Indeed, it was Mr. Pembroke, the very man who had revived the graveyard walk. His hand was clenched tightly around something, a torn piece of parchment, stained and half buried in the damp earth. The vicar stammered, "We must fetch the constable quickly." Miss Marple said nothing. Her gaze lingered on the parchment, the disturbed soil around the grave, and the faint mark upon the iron cross as though someone had tried to move it. She rose slowly, her voice soft yet steady. "Strange, isn't it?" she murmured to no one in particular. "How the dead never quite rest when the living disturb their secrets." And with that quiet remark, the peaceful village of Mary Mead slipped into the shadow of a mystery that would reveal far more than superstition and death, one that would uncover a secret buried far deeper than any grave. Lanterns sputtered in the damp as the villagers drew back from the body, murmuring in fragments. Shock does not permit full sentences, Miss Marple always thought, only shards of them. The vicar hurriedly sent Martin Blythe running for Constable Reeves, and Martin went off at a ragged sprint, his pirate sash trailing and catching burrs along the path. Mrs. Pembroke, her lips pressed to a bloodless line, stood very straight and very still, as if the mere refusal to sway might hold the world to its order. She made no move toward her husband, which many might consider heartless. Miss Marple, who did not traffic in easy judgments, noted only that the woman's eyes scarcely left the iron cross on the forbidden grave. Someone fetched a rug from the vestry, and another someone, Mrs. Hartwell, whose kindness always arrived before permission, knelt to drape it over Mr. Pembroke. Miss Marple touched the good lady's sleeve. "If you please, best to leave him as he is, just until the constable has had a look." Mrs. Hartwell rose, chastened but not offended, and backed away, her lantern trembling. The parchment in Mr. Pembroke's hand had caught Miss Marple's attention, not for what it plainly was, a fragment, cracked at the edges and damp, but for its curious smell, a bitterness like old ink mixed with church polish. She did not stoop to take it. She merely observed the way the torn side feathered, and how the mud clung to it in a narrow crescent, suggesting it had been pressed lightly into the earth rather than gripped in a dying struggle. People in distress clutch. This had been placed to be found. She let her gaze wander, in that unfocused fashion useful for noticing. There were scuffs in the moss at the base of the iron cross, and a smear where the patina had been disturbed. The cross was heavy, yet the ground just before it, between the grave and Mr. Pembroke's boots, held two clear arcs, as of something dragged a fraction and set back again. It was the sort of fussy adjustment a house-proud maid might make to a mat, except the mat was a symbol of interdiction. Constable Reeves arrived with his notebook and his careful, deliberate manner, which villagers admired because it looked like competence. He made a small ring of his hands to herd the crowd away, and then glanced at Miss Marple with respectful unease. "Evening, miss. I'll see to it." "I know you will," she said mildly. "Do forgive me if I remark perhaps a torch upon the cross. The damp makes lanterns flattering." Under the beam of Reeves's torch, the smear upon the iron showed green, black, and fresh, and just below it a pale scuff marred the stone lip of the grave. Reeves pursed his mouth. "Looks as though someone fiddled with it, but that thing weighs the better part of a man." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "and not the better part of Mr. Pembroke, I think. He had a way of handing heavy tasks to younger arms." She glanced to where Martin Blythe hovered, chest heaving, eyes bright with the thrill and horror of it all. Martin worked odd jobs at the hall and sometimes helped with the flower stands. He had the look of a boy raised to lift what others pointed at. Mrs. Pembroke at last spoke. "My husband revived the walk to raise funds for the roof. He was enthusiastic, perhaps too much so, but he would never have interfered with consecrated ground." The last phrase was crisp, rehearsed. Miss Marple fancied it had been used before at a breakfast table, where argument pretended to be conversation. "Beggin' your pardon, ma'am," Reeves said. "I'll be needin' to ask where you last saw Mr. Pembroke afore the walk." "In the vestry," she replied, not looking at the body. "He went to fetch the lanterns and the list of donors for the collection box. He was quite particular about the names." "The names?" the vicar echoed, seizing at the safer topic. Yes, Mr. Pembroke believed in acknowledgement. A plaque, perhaps. He said people give more if they think their charity will be remembered, or if they fear it won't," Miss Marple said, almost to herself. She thought of the parchment again, and its ink-sour smell. A list is a kind of power in a small place. Who is named, and who is not? Reeves crouched, peered at the parchment, and used a handkerchief to tease it free. "Half a sheet," he muttered. He shone his torch. "Looks like old writing? Church hand. The top's torn, by order of something. Below that, not to be opened, save upon. And then it's gone." He swallowed. "Opened. Like a grave. Do you suppose? Or a box? Miss Marple said lightly. We oughtn't to be morbid in our imaginations, Constable. If one starts with graves, one ends with ghosts, and the truth usually lives in cupboards. She smiled at him because men do better when you give them back their ground. They carried the crowd away in small motions. The vicar took the children back to the hall. Mrs. Hartwell murmured practicalities at those threatening faintness. Martin Blythe volunteered to fetch blankets for the older folk. Left mostly in the hush of the yews, Reeves and Miss Marple walked the ark from the porch to the forbidden grave. Lantern drips made a necklace of light along the path. Reeves pointed at a set of prints' sharp heel, then a slight twist at the toe. Mr. Pembroke's shoes do that, he said. He had the beginnings of a bunion. And there, Miss Marple said, indicating a second track, lighter and narrower, stepping carefully in the hollows between stones. A person accustomed to walking here without being seen, choosing the quieter places to set a foot. She tilted her head. I have never yet known a gardener who could do otherwise. Discretion becomes muscle memory. Mr. Nash, Reeves grunted, keeps the churchyard tidy. Odd sort. Don't say much. Many men who choose plants prefer their company to ours, Miss Marple said kindly. It does not make them murderous, though it might make them witnesses to little shifts and changes no one else would bother to notice. Reeves folded the parchment into an envelope, sealed it, and scribbled, We'll ask Mr. Nash first thing, and Mrs. Pembroke, and the vicar, and Mrs. Hartwell always in the way of things. She is. He hesitated. Do you, would you? I will make a cup of tea, Miss Marple said. Beyond that, my dear Reeves, you must do your duty, and I must do what old ladies do best. Remember, one collects people, you know. Bits of them, their tempers and their economies, and the peculiar ways they wash a cup. One never knows which little bit will matter. As they turned to go, a glint caught her eye where the grave met the root of the yew. She bent a movement that always made others want to help, which is why she did it slowly, and saw a sliver of wax lodged in the bark crevice. Not the pale beeswax the churchwomen used for polish, but the smoky residue of a dark candle. She did not exclaim. She merely marked the place in her mind, alongside Mrs. Pembroke's fixed gaze and Martin's eager alacrity and the vicar's eagerness to speak of plaques rather than graves. Later, when the body had been carried discreetly to the vestry and the village hall's music returned in a softer key, Miss Marple sat in her neat sitting room with a plain cup and saucer and the quiet knowledge that the forbidden grave had been used not as a superstition but as a stage. The iron cross, the torn decree, the dragged inch all pointed to a performance set for an audience that would gasp in unison. Performances have producers, and in small villages, producers have reasons that look very like grudges or debts. She thought of the list of donors and how Mr. Pembroke liked names engraved, and how engraved names sometimes hide the ones never written down at all, the silent benefactors who prefer secrecy because their money comes with strings that snag. She thought of dark candles and of ceremonies best kept tucked behind poetry. The sort of amateur theatrics respectable people employ when plain speech would do. She thought, finally, of Mrs. Pembroke's refusal to step nearer, not in horror but in judgment, and of the gardener who walked in silence where others wouldn't look. When the clock chimed 11, Miss Marple folded her hands and, in the privacy of her own heart, admitted the obvious. The parchment had not summoned death. It had advertised it. Someone had needed Mr. Pembroke to be found at the grave, and by many eyes. The question, then, was not how he died, but who profited most by the lesson his death was meant to teach. The following morning dawned bleak and windless, as though the village itself were holding its breath. A fine drizzle drifted over the churchyard, softening the outlines of the gravestones until they seemed to lean inward like weary listeners. Miss Marple, having finished her modest breakfast and tidied away the cup, wrapped herself in her blue shawl and set out for Street Luke's. She had no formal errand there, at least none she would have described aloud. But certain questions, she believed, were best answered by the air of a place before too many people had trampled their opinions through it. Constable Reeves was already by the gate, speaking to Mr. Nash, the gardener. The man's stooped back was turned, his coat damp at the shoulders. Reeves, upon spotting Miss Marple, straightened as if in relief. "Good morning, miss. We were just discussing the walk. Mr. Nash says he left before the lantern procession reached the old ground." "Quite right," said Nash without turning. His voice was low and steady. "I'd finished with the tools, locked the shed. Didn't see a soul near the forbidden grave. Not until all that noise after." Miss Marple regarded him gently. "It must be rather lonely work at dusk, tending among the stones." "I don't mind quiet," he replied. "The dead keep better company than most." Reeves frowned, not sure if it was a joke. Miss Marple merely nodded, studying the mud at Nash's boots, a darker patch than the path would explain. "The soil clings terribly after a night's rain," she said. "And yet you've brushed it off your trousers so carefully. A tidy habit, that." "Old habit," Nash muttered. "My mother kept house for the vicar once. She couldn't abide dirt indoors." He excused himself and strode away toward the lychgate gate. Reeves sighed. "Odd bird, that one. Still, he's steady. Never any trouble." "Steady people can move stones as easily as reckless ones," Miss Marple said softly, then smiled to temper the remark. "But let us not make villains too soon. Did you find anything more of the parchment?" Reeves shook his head. "Nothing yet. The coroner'll come this afternoon. Doctor says Mr. Pembroke took a hard blow at the base of the skull, something round and smooth. No sign of a struggle. Could have been a walking stick, maybe." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Or the handle of a lantern, perhaps. They're quite heavy when swung." The constable blinked. "Well now, the young fellow Martin had one, didn't he? Said he dropped it when the scream came." "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "He did drop it, and was clever enough to retrieve it before anyone noticed, I imagine. Young men dislike being seen as careless." Walked together toward the grave. The iron cross gleamed wetly. Reeves bent to point at the disturbed earth. "We measured. The stone's been moved exactly 1 inch. Couldn't say why anyone would bother for so little." "Oh, an inch can mean a great deal," Miss Marple murmured. "Enough to slide a hand beneath, or to show that one could move it without lifting the whole weight. A demonstration of strength, perhaps, or defiance." From the church door came Mrs. Pembroke, veiled and immaculate. Her composure was almost defiant in its stillness. "Constable," she said, "I've come to fetch my husband's coat. He'll not need it, but I should like to see it properly cleaned." Reeves hesitated. "Best wait till we're done, ma'am." She inclined her head, but her gaze flicked past him toward Miss Marple. "I understand you were present, Miss Marple. It must have been dreadful." "Yes, dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, quietly, "and puzzling. You mentioned last night that your husband kept a list of donors. Might one ask if the list is missing?" Mrs. Pembroke's hand tightened on her glove. It was in his pocket. "I gave it to the constable." "Why?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "I wondered if perhaps someone's name had been left off it. Someone who thought it ought to be there." The woman's eyes flickered. "Just once. People are always slighted over such things. But my husband was meticulous. He would never forget a contribution." Miss Marple inclined her head, her tone mild. "I dare say he would not. Yet memory, like charity, may sometimes depend on what one wishes to remember." Mrs. Pembroke drew herself up. "You speak in riddles, Miss Marple." "Only reflections, my dear," she said kindly, "the sort that come to those with more years than distractions." After the widow had gone, Reeves turned to her. "Do you think she's hiding something?" "Not hiding," Miss Marple said. "Guarding. There's a difference. People guard what still matters to them. I should like, Constable, to know where that parchment came from. It smelt of the vestry's polish." and one doesn't polish graves. Reeves nodded slowly. We'll search the vestry after service. The vicar won't mind. Miss Marple gave him an approving glance. Good. And perhaps look to see if one of the lanterns bears a dent on its rim. As Reeves jotted that down, the church bell tolled the quarter hour, echoing across the damp stones. Miss Marple turned toward the village street, her shawl pulled close. She had seen the faint glimmer of wax again, this time near the path that led to the gardener's shed, and she thought, as she walked, how very much human mischief liked to borrow the dignity of old superstition. By midday the rain had ceased, leaving the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and old stone. The villagers, ever curious, lingered near the church despite Reeves's warnings. Gossip had already rooted itself in every conversation. Some spoke of curses, others of old debts. And one particularly imaginative baker's wife insisted that Mr. Pembroke had angered the spirits by opening the grave. Miss Marple, however, spent the morning quietly indoors, knitting by her window while her thoughts worked with the same patient precision as her needles. When she finally rose to visit the vestry, she did so not from curiosity but from habit, the habit of seeing what others overlooked. Constable Reeves met her at the door, a little flushed from the search. "We've looked through the drawers and cupboards, miss," he said, holding up a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Found this tucked behind the hymnals." Inside lay several sheets of parchment, yellowed with age, written in a looping hand that seemed to belong to another century. "Looks like church records. Some missing pages, though." Miss Marple glanced at the remaining sheets, her eyes pausing on one, line by order of the Bishop of Chichester. To be sealed and not disturbed. She folded the parchment carefully. A record of interment, perhaps. But sealed for what reason, I wonder? Reeves scratched his chin. "You think that's what Pembroke was after?" "Perhaps," she said softly. "But curiosity rarely kills respectable men. Pride, resentment, or fear, those are more reliable motives." At that moment, the vicar entered, his face pale but resolute. "Constable, I must protest this intrusion. These papers are sacred records. They've lain undisturbed since before my time." Reeves straightened, defensive. "A man's been murdered, Reverend." "Sacred or not, we've got to see what's been tampered with," Miss Marple interjected gently. "Of course. And I'm sure the vicar understands that preserving truth is also a sacred duty." Her tone softened the blow, and after a brief hesitation, the vicar sighed. "There were stories," he admitted. "The grave marked with the iron cross was said to belong to a stranger buried at night. Some said he was a convict, others that he was a foreigner. The records were sealed because the burial broke canon law, but no one believed it mattered anymore." Miss Marple nodded. "Except Mr. Pembroke, who revived a walk that led everyone straight to it." The vicar looked troubled. He wanted the event to draw attention. The church roof fund had been languishing. He said a little mystery would bring donors. "Yes," she said, and he brought more than he expected. Before the vicar could respond, Martin Blythe appeared at the door, holding his cap in both hands. His face was pale, his usual boyish enthusiasm gone. "Constable Reeves," he said shakily. "I found this near the gardener's shed. Thought maybe it was nothing, but well, it's got blood on it." He handed over a lantern, its brass rim dented at one side. Reeves turned it over, whistling low. "Good lad, Martin. Where exactly did you find it?" "Behind the shed, near the compost heap," he said. "There's a patch of disturbed soil there, too. Looked like something had been buried. But I didn't want to dig without asking." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered faintly. "How thoughtful of you, Martin. You've quite the careful nature." They followed him to the shed. The ground there was uneven, and sure enough, beneath a thin layer of soil lay a small tin box dented, rusted, but sealed tight. Reeves pried it open with his penknife. Inside were several envelopes bound by a ribbon, their edges brittle and darkened with age. He unfolded one, then frowned. "Letters," he said, "all signed with the same name, Edward Nash." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her mind. Nash, the gardener's father, perhaps. Could be, Reeves muttered. But these are addressed to Margaret Pembroke. There was a silence heavy enough to press the air flat. The vicar crossed himself. Miss Marple took one letter delicately and read a few lines. The handwriting trembled with emotion, a young man's confession of love, dated nearly 30 years ago. So, she said quietly, it seems the forbidden grave was not the only secret buried in this churchyard. Reeves exhaled. If those were found, Mrs. Pembroke would have every reason to keep quiet. But why kill the husband? Miss Marple gazed toward the churchyard, her voice almost a whisper. Because secrets, when unearthed, rarely stay where they are meant to. Someone must have feared that Mr. Pembroke was about to uncover what these letters meant and whom they condemned. Reeves looked uneasy. You think Mrs. Pembroke knew about them? Perhaps not until recently. But someone did. Someone who knew that the past was about to step forward again. As they sealed the tin box and walked back toward the vestry, Miss Marple paused by the path where the candle wax had melted into the earth. "Constable," she said, "would you be so kind as to keep that lantern safe? Its dent tells a story, and I rather think it has more to say." And though Reeves nodded briskly, Miss Marple's thoughts had already moved ahead to Mrs. Pembroke's perfect composure, to Nash's silence, and to the uneasy truth that love, once buried, can fester far more dangerously than hate. The afternoon light was weak and silvery as it filtered through the stained glass windows of Street Luke's, scattering fragments of color across the stone floor. Miss Marple sat quietly in one of the back pews, hands folded on her umbrella, her gaze not on the altar but on the vestry door. Through the narrow crack, she could hear the murmur of Constable Reeves questioning Mrs. Pembroke. The widow's voice, though soft, carried that certain brittle clarity that always suggested someone struggling to remain composed under strain. When Reeves emerged, his face was troubled. "She admits knowing about the letters," he said quietly. "Claims her husband found them when he was cleaning the vestry shelves a few weeks ago. He was furious, said they disgraced her family name. She swears she didn't know how they got into the church at all." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Disgrace can mean many things. Constable, a love letter from long ago is only shameful if it exposes something someone else would rather keep hidden. She said the letters were from Edward Nash, the gardener's father, just as you guessed. A romance, years before she married Pembroke. The vicar confirmed the dates line up. But it doesn't explain why Mr. Pembroke ended up dead in the graveyard. "No," said Miss Marple softly, "but it does explain why someone feared his sense of righteousness. Some men consider virtue a weapon." They stepped outside into the chill air. The villagers were scattering now, the initial excitement giving way to whispers that would travel from house to house like a contagion. Across the lane, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Nash at his gate, smoking a short pipe. His eyes followed them without expression, but she saw how his fingers trembled slightly as he tamped the tobacco. "Would you mind, Constable," she said, "if I had a few words with Mr. Nash alone? Old people talk more easily to other old people. It's one of our few advantages." Reeves nodded, though reluctantly, and walked toward the churchyard path. Miss Marple approached the gardener with the air of one about to discuss nothing more important than the weather. "Such a pity about the rain," she began. "It will play havoc with your flower beds. Though I must say, your roses by the vestry door have been quite splendid this year." Nash gave a small grunt. "Roses'll bloom wherever they please, ma'am. I just trim what's left after the frost." "Quite right," she said cheerfully. "It's much the same with memories, I find. We can cut them back, but they always grow again when the weather's right." He stiffened, the pipe halting midway to his lips. "If you've come to ask about those letters—" "I've come to ask about Margaret Pembroke," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "You see, I've been wondering why her husband chose Halloween night, of all nights, to stage that silly graveyard walk. It's rather theatrical, don't you think? Unless he wanted a public setting for a private revelation. Nash's eyes flicked toward the church, then away. He said he'd ruin her, he muttered. Told me so himself a week ago. Said the village ought to know what kind of woman his wife really was. That she'd once been engaged to a criminal's son. He wanted to read those letters out loud during the walk right there by the grave. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. And you told him not to, I suppose. I told him to leave the past where it was buried. Hoarsely. But he laughed. Said a man's reputation shouldn't rot in the ground just because decent folk prefer to forget. He crushed the pipe's ashes underfoot, so I went to the church that night. Thought maybe I could stop him, but when I got there, he was already dead. Miss Marple studied his face. The sorrow in it was real, but not untainted by guilt. You found him before the others, then? He hesitated. I didn't touch him. Only saw the lantern light on his coat. Then I heard voices coming from the hall and ran. I knew how it would look. Yes, she said softly. And yet, Mr. Nash, you stayed near the grave afterward. The soil under your boots told me that much. I think you tried to hide the letters again, didn't you? His mouth tightened. I couldn't let them fall into the wrong hands. She doesn't deserve the shame. But someone else, Miss Marple murmured, believed she did, and perhaps thought that killing Mr. Pembroke would also keep suspicion away from another secret entirely. Nash looked up sharply, confusion flickering across his weathered face. Another secret? Miss Marple gave him a mild, sad smile. Oh, my dear man, there's always more than one. In small villages, sins overlap like roots beneath the soil. I believe you tried to protect Mrs. Pembroke, but you may have protected the wrong person altogether. Reeves appeared then, calling from the path. Miss Marple, they've found something by the yew tree. She turned toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Something? He held up a cloth-wrapped object, a walking stick with dried blood on the tip, found halfway buried near the cross. Miss Marple looked from the stick to Nash, whose face had gone white as paper. How curious, she murmured. When everyone's carrying lanterns, only one man carries a stick. And it seems that stick has been trying very hard to stay hidden. Constable Reeves laid the walking stick across a flat gravestone, his brow furrowed. The stick was finely made dark mahogany with a silver band near the handle, the initials E.N., delicately engraved. The bloodstain at its end had dried to a dull brown, but there was no mistaking what it meant. Miss Marple regarded it with quiet gravity, her mind turning not on what was obvious, but on what was missing. Whoever had used the stick had been careful enough to hide it, yet careless enough to leave their initials. And that, she thought, was never a coincidence. Edward Nash, Reeves muttered, tracing the letters with his thumb. The gardener's father again, but he's been dead these 10 years. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Indeed, which makes the stick rather more interesting. Someone kept it, Constable. People don't hold on to the possessions of the dead unless they mean something. Sentiment, guilt, perhaps, or protection. Nash stood a few paces away, his hands clenched. His voice came out rough. That stick was my father's. I lost it months ago. Thought it had been nicked from the shed. Lost, Miss Marple repeated softly, her eyes fixed on him, or borrowed. It's such a useful sort of thing. After all, sturdy, weighted, and easy to mistake for a walking aid on a dark night. Reeves shot her a look. You're not saying, Nash. I'm saying, she interrupted gently, that truth rarely travels alone. Sometimes it brings others with it, walking quietly beside. She stepped closer to the stick, studying its underside. The silver band bore faint scratches, marks where a ring or key might have struck it. This wasn't left behind by accident, she said. It was placed. Whoever hid it knew it would be found soon enough. Reeves frowned. To frame someone, then? Precisely. The initials make it convenient. The gardener said nothing, but the colour had drained from his face. Miss Marple's expression softened. "You cared for Mrs. Pembroke once, didn't you? When she was still Margaret Hartwell. Your father's affection for her was not entirely one-sided." Nash swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. He was in love with her. She might have loved him back once, but her family thought him beneath her. When he died, she never came to the funeral. And yet, Miss Marple said, he kept her letters. Or perhaps you did, after him. You couldn't bear to burn them. That's why they ended up in the church, not as a confession, but as a shrine. Then Pembroke must have found them there. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and if he threatened to expose them, that would give someone every reason to silence him. But not Mr. Nash. His guilt is too old to kill for. No, the person who struck that blow is younger, quicker, and very sure of what must never come to light." As she spoke, the church bell tolled 4 times, and from beyond the lich gate came the sound of hurried footsteps. Martin Blythe appeared, pale and breathless once again. "Constable, I've just seen Mrs. Pembroke at the hall. She's packing, said she's going to her sister's in Eastbourne tonight. But she was burning papers in the stove." Reeves's head snapped up. "Burning what papers?" "Couldn't tell," the boy said, but she looked frightened. Not sad, just desperate. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Desperation has a peculiar scent, Constable. It usually comes from someone cornered not by guilt, but by knowledge." They made their way swiftly toward the village hall. Smoke curled from the chimney, sharp and acrid. Mrs. Pembroke stood at the hearth, her gloved hands trembling as she fed small, torn scraps into the flames. She turned when they entered, her poise faltering only for a second. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Reeves lifted the stick. "You recognize this, ma'am?" She stared at it blankly. "Should I?" "It belonged to Edward Nash," Miss Marple said softly. "Your first love's father, the one your husband intended to shame you with." The widow's face went white. "Where did you find it?" "In the graveyard," Miss Marple replied. "And there's blood on it, enough to tell us it was used to strike Mr. Pembroke. I wonder when you saw that stick in your husband's hand that night, did you realize whose name it bore?" "Mrs." Pembroke's composure cracked like glass. "He found it in the vestry, said it was a sign that God himself meant to reveal my disgrace. He wouldn't listen to reason." She drew a sharp breath. "I didn't kill him. I went to plead with him. Yes, but someone else was there before me. When I reached the grave, he was already lying there." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Then you saw someone." The woman hesitated, then whispered. "A shadow moved near the yew trees. I thought it was Mr. Nash, but when I called his name, there was no answer, only the sound of footsteps hurrying away." Reeves scribbled furiously, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. A shadow by the yews, a stick planted as bait, and a frightened widow burning the past, too many performances for one stage. "Mrs. Pembroke," she said quietly, "who told you your husband planned to read those letters in public?" The widow's eyes filled with tears. "Martin," she said faintly. "Martin Blythe. He overheard my husband boasting in the vestry." Miss Marple's voice, though gentle, carried a weight that made even Reeves glance up. "Then, Constable, perhaps it's time we spoke again with young Martin. It seems he's been closer to this tragedy than any of us guessed." Martin Blythe stood in the doorway of the village hall, the faintest trace of soot on his sleeves and a nervous flicker in his eyes. His boyish charm, which usually softened even the sternest glares from the villagers, seemed to have deserted him entirely. He shifted from foot to foot as Miss Marple and Constable Reeves approached. "You wanted to see me, sir?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. "We did, lad. Mrs. Pembroke says you told her about her husband's plan to read those old letters aloud. How did you come by that information?" Martin's gaze darted between them. "I heard it by accident. I was sweeping the vestry after the rehearsal for the walk. Mr. Pembroke was talking to the vicar, said something about dragging up the truth and teaching his wife a lesson. I didn't mean to listen. But he was shouting. Miss Marple's eyes, calm as ever, watched him carefully. "That was thoughtful of you, Martin, to warn Mrs. Pembroke. Yet, I wonder, did you do so out of kindness, or out of something else?" He blinked, startled. "Something else, ma'am. Curiosity, perhaps, or guilt. It's so easy for young people to think they can mend what older hearts have broken. Sometimes they only make the crack wider." His throat bobbed. "I didn't mean any harm. I liked Mrs. Pembroke. Everyone does. She's kind, always polite. I just thought, well, she didn't deserve to be humiliated." Miss Marple nodded gently. "A noble impulse. To protect a lady's dignity. But nobility can turn dangerous when mixed with fear. Tell me, Martin, when did you last see Mr. Pembroke alive?" Martin's hands twitched. "After the lantern procession started, he told me to fetch the donation box from the hall and meet him by the old grave. Said he'd left it there as part of the show. When I got there, he wasn't standing anymore." "You found him?" Reeves asked sharply. Martin hesitated. "Not exactly. I saw something lying by the grave, but I thought he'd dropped his cloak. Then someone screamed, and everyone came running. I panicked, went back toward the hall." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You see, Constable, how easily panic becomes convenience. A boy runs away, another discovers the body, and a murderer vanishes between those two moments." Reeves frowned. "You think he's lying?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "he's telling the truth in all the wrong places. There's honesty in his fear, but fear of what?" She turned back to Martin, who now looked close to tears. "You were carrying a lantern that night. The constable tells me it had a dent in the rim, as though dropped against stone. That must have happened when you tripped, didn't it?" He nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I dropped it when the scream came." "And did you pick it up before or after you saw Mr. Pembroke lying there?" A pause. His lips parted, then pressed shut again. "After," he whispered. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him for a long moment. "You see, Constable, the dent on that lantern rim matches the bruise on Mr. Pembroke's skull almost perfectly. Not deep enough for a single deadly blow, but enough to daze him enough for someone else to finish the work without resistance." Martin's face went pale. "You think I—" "No, I swear I didn't. I heard something behind me when I bent down. Footsteps, quick ones. I turned, but it was too dark. I thought it was Mrs. Pembroke coming, so I ran. I didn't tell anyone because they'd think, well, they'd think just what you're thinking now." Reeves scowled. "You should have spoken up, boy. Keeping quiet never helped anyone." But Miss Marple was frowning not at Martin, but at the description. "Footsteps," she repeated. "Not heavy, not dragging." "Quick, you said?" He nodded eagerly. "Yes, light and fast, like someone who knew exactly where they were going." "Then it wasn't Mrs. Pembroke," Miss Marple said softly. "Her shoes have narrow heels that sink in soft ground. Yet the prints by the grave were small and flat. Practical. Shoes. A man's shoes, but like a younger man's stride." Reeves rubbed his temple. "That could fit half the village, miss." "Yes," she replied. "But not half the village had reason to silence Mr. Pembroke. He planned his revelation with too much noise, and noise attracts ears that should not hear." Her eyes moved back to Martin. "Did Mr. Pembroke ever say who told him about those letters in the first place?" The boy frowned, trying to recall. "He said someone sent him a note. It was in his pocket the day he found them typed, not written. He said it came from an anonymous friend of the church." "I didn't think much of it." Miss Marple's lips curved, though not in amusement. "Anonymous friends are rarely friendly. And typing, you say? That narrows things considerably." Reeves blinked. "How so?" "In a village like ours," she said gently, "only one household owns a typewriter, the vicar's study. And if the vicar's machine wrote that note, then this little play has had a far cleverer stage manager than we've yet realized." Martin's breath caught. You don't mean... Miss Marple rose, her voice calm but certain. I mean, Constable, that we must speak with the Reverend immediately, before the next confession is made to the wrong kind of altar. The vicarage sat at the far end of the green, a modest stone house half hidden behind ivy and laurel hedges. Its windows were dim, though a faint glow flickered in the study upstairs. As Miss Marple and Constable Reeves approached, the faint hum of the church organ drifted from within, a melancholy sound, almost reverent, as though the building itself mourned the chaos its flock had brought upon it. Reeves knocked sharply. After a moment, the vicar himself appeared, his expression a picture of strained composure. "Constable," he said, voice calm but weary. "Miss Marple, what brings you here so late?" Miss Marple smiled, kindly, her eyes studying the ink smudge on his fingers, the faint indentation of paper pressed against his palm. "We're sorry to intrude, Reverend, but a few matters have arisen that require your assistance. You've always been so obliging in matters of truth." He hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course. Do come in." The study was warm, the fire banked low. Papers lay scattered across the desk, and on the side table, a typewriter rested, its ribbon fresh, its keys recently wiped. Reeves's eyes went straight to it, but Miss Marple moved first, as if by accident, resting her glove upon the table edge. "A fine machine," she murmured. "It must have been very helpful when preparing church notices or anonymous notes, perhaps." The vicar blinked. "Anonymous notes? I'm not sure I understand." Reeves stepped forward, his tone firmer. Mr. Pembroke received a typed message before his death, urging him to reopen that grave and make a spectacle of it. "You're the only man in the village with a typewriter." The vicar's eyes flickered to the desk before settling back on Reeves. "Surely you don't imagine I'd encourage such blasphemy. Pembroke's theatrical schemes were his own." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "And yet, Reverend, you didn't stop him. You see, I've always believed that silence can be as deliberate as speech, particularly when the silence benefits the speaker." He bristled faintly. "You're suggesting I had something to gain by his death?" "Not gain," Miss Marple said softly. "Perhaps protection. There's a great difference. You see, someone knew about those letters long before Mr. Pembroke discovered them. Someone who had every opportunity to find them in the vestry, someone who might have handled them when preparing the church archives. You, perhaps." His mouth opened, then closed again. The fire popped, filling the silence. "I came across them by accident," he said finally, "months ago. They were tucked inside an old prayer book. I thought to destroy them they were indecent, personal. But then, Mr. Pembroke came to me about his plan for the Halloween event, and I may have hinted that some hidden story lay in the graveyard's history. I meant to distract him, not provoke disaster." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the note?" He sighed. "Yes, I typed it. Foolishly. I thought if he had a mystery to chase, he'd leave those letters alone. It was only mischief, Miss Marple. I never imagined he'd actually... Dear God, what have I done?" Reeves rubbed his chin. "So you admit writing the message that lured him there? That's a grave mistake, Reverend." The vicar's eyes widened with panic. "But I didn't kill him. I swear it." "I left the hall before the procession began. I went home to fetch the hymn list for the evening service. Ask anyone they saw me leave." Miss Marple's eyes were distant, her thoughts running in quiet, intricate circles. "Yes," she said. "You went home. But you didn't return until after the scream, did you?" "No," he said, his voice trembling. "I heard it from my window. I ran back at once." "Indeed," she murmured. "And yet your lantern was found extinguished, lying by the churchyard gate. You must have dropped it in your haste." The vicar's head snapped up. "That's impossible." I left my lantern in the church porch." Reeves frowned. "We found it near the gate this morning, smudged with soil from the yew path." The vicar sank into his chair, pale and sweating. "I can't explain that. Someone must have moved it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone was cool. I believe you didn't kill Mr. Pembroke, Reverend. But you did set the scene. You created a story that others used for darker purposes. You gave the murderer both motive and opportunity without ever lifting a hand yourself. Reeves leaned closer. Then who did lift a hand? Miss Marple glanced toward the window, where rain streaked the glass like ink across parchment. The answer, she said quietly, is in the timing. Mr. Pembroke was struck twice, the first blow light, the second fatal. The first could have come from Martin's lantern, quite by accident, but the second required strength and intent, someone who arrived moments later, under the cover of the crowd. Reeves stared. You mean? Yes, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Someone who knew exactly where Mr. Pembroke would stand, who had every reason to reach the grave first. Someone who understood that a staged legend makes a perfect hiding place for murder. The vicar's voice was hoarse. You mean Nash? Miss Marple did not answer. Instead, she turned to Reeves. Constable, you must fetch Mr. Nash at once. And bring the tin box of letters too. I believe the truth, like those letters, was buried twice, once for love and once for shame. Let us see which of those motives has risen again tonight. The constable wasted no time. Within half an hour, Reeves had returned to the vicarage, rain glistening on his coat, and behind him trudged Mr. Nash, hat pulled low, boots thick with mud, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, though her eyes were far from idle. The vicar hovered by the doorway, wringing his hands, clearly wishing himself anywhere else. Reeves closed the door behind them with a decisive click. All right, Nash. Miss Marple believes there's something you've not told us. I'd advise you to speak plainly now. Nash's voice came rough and low. I've said all I know. Pembroke was dead when I found him. I never touched the man. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. No, I don't think you did. But you knew who did, or at least who was there when he fell. His jaw tightened. What makes you think that? The ground, she said simply. You walked the path to the grave so many times that you know every uneven patch. And yet, after the murder, your footprints hesitated near the yew roots. You avoided a spot you usually step across without thought. When people know what they might find, they choose their footing carefully. Nash said nothing, but his fingers twitched at his sides. Reeves leaned forward. We found your father's walking stick near the grave. You can't explain that either, can you? His head bowed for a moment, and then he sighed, a long, tired sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than guilt. I didn't hide the stick, but I knew it was there. My father gave it to me before he died, said it had unfinished work in it. I thought he was raving. Poor old soul. When I saw Pembroke lying there, I saw that stick by the iron cross, and God forgive me, I thought it was a sign. Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but firm. A sign to do what, Mr. Nash? He hesitated, then looked up at her with a strange, almost desperate honesty. To protect her, Mrs. Pembroke. My father loved her once. I reckon I've been protecting her all my life without even meaning to. I moved the stick so no one would think she'd done it. I thought the sight of her name on those letters would ruin her. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, but I did hide the truth. The constable scribbled something in his notebook but said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her thoughts were sharper than ever. That's a noble confession, Mr. Nash, but it's not the whole story. Because whoever killed Mr. Pembroke also planted that stick where it would lead directly back to you. That's not justice, it's design. Nash frowned. Design? Yes, she said, rising slowly. And the designer knew exactly how you'd behave once suspicion fell. You'd keep silent to protect Mrs. Pembroke, just as you've done for years. You'd let the weight of guilt crush you rather than see her suffer. The vicar, who had remained pale and silent, now spoke in a trembling voice. Surely you're not suggesting Margaret Pembroke arranged all this? Miss Marple turned to him. No, Reverend. I'm suggesting someone who loved her arranged it. Someone younger, impulsive, and eager to be her savior. She looked to Reeves. Where is Martin Blythe? Reeves blinked. He was outside when I left the hall, said he'd go home. Why? Because, Miss Marple said softly, I believe he never went home at all. As if on cue, the faint creak of the front steps sounded through the vicarage. Reeves strode to the door and threw it open. There stood Martin, soaked, pale and trembling, his eyes wide with the terror of a boy who has run out of lies. I couldn't go home, he stammered. I heard you talking in the hall earlier about the stick, the letters, the grave. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would all pass. But it won't. It never does it? Miss Marple stepped toward him, her tone not accusing but unbearably gentle. No, dear. Secrets never stay buried. Not in a place as small as this. Martin's shoulders sagged. He was shouting at her. In front of everyone, he was going to shame her. Said he'd read the letters, tell the whole village what she'd done. I couldn't let him. I went to the grave early, before the others came. I only meant to warn him to make him stop. But he laughed. Said she'd be a lesson to every hypocrite in the parish. He grabbed my arm and called me her little errand boy. I swung the lantern without thinking. It just hit him, harder than I meant. Miss Marple nodded, her face grave. The first blow, she murmured. The one that dazed him. Martin's voice broke. He fell, but he was still breathing. I panicked. I heard someone coming, Mr. Nash, I think. I hid behind the yews. Then I saw her. Mrs. Pembroke. She knelt beside him, crying. I wanted to go to her, but she turned, saw the blood and screamed. After that, everyone came running. I ran too. Reeves exhaled sharply, the tension in the room snapping like a string. So that's it then. You killed him. But Miss Marple's eyes, calm and piercing, lingered on the boy's face. Not murder, Constable. Passion and fear, yes, but not malice. The cruelty belonged to the man who set these wheels in motion. The Reverend's note began it, Mr. Pembroke's pride fed it, and the village's gossip finished it. Young Martin merely acted where others thought. Reeves lowered his voice. You think the magistrate will see it that way? Miss Marple sighed. Perhaps not. But God will, and he's rather better at weighing motives than we are. As Martin was led out into the damp night, Nash sank into the chair by the fire, his head in his hands. The vicar stood frozen, the typewriter gleaming accusingly beside him. Miss Marple turned to the window, where the rain had begun again, washing the churchyard clean. The trouble with secrets, she said softly, is that they always bloom in the dark until someone's blood waters them. The vicarage was still when Martin's footsteps faded down the path with Reeves beside him, the sound swallowed by the steady hiss of rain. Miss Marple remained by the hearth, her delicate hands folded loosely in her lap. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing like watchful eyes. Nash sat opposite her, his shoulders bent, staring into the coals as if searching for his father's ghost. The vicar lingered near the doorway, unable to sit, his face etched with remorse. It's a strange business, Reeves had muttered before leaving. A boy killing by accident, a man dead by pride, and half the village tangled in the story. Now that the house was quiet again, Miss Marple's thoughts moved with their own soft rhythm, weaving through the evening's revelations. Something still troubled her, not the guilt, not the sorrow, but the order of events. It was neat, too neat, as though someone had arranged it to close just so. And Miss Marple had learned long ago that tidy endings were the invention of liars. You knew, didn't you? She said suddenly, her eyes on Nash, that Martin cared for Mrs. Pembroke. He looked up sharply, startled. Knew? I suspected yes. He followed her about like a lost pup. I told him to leave her be, she'd had enough pain. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, and you meant to protect her, as your father once tried. History repeating itself. Mr. Nash. Except this time, the cost was blood. Nash rubbed his face wearily. She didn't ask for it. None of it. Pembroke made her life a misery, controlling, cruel. He'd belittle her at every turn. I reckon the boy saw that and thought himself her champion. Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. And yet, champions sometimes act with a little help. Tell me, when you found Mr. Pembroke's body, was the lantern still burning? He frowned, searching memory. No, the light had gone out. Exactly, she murmured. That puzzled me from the beginning. The lantern Martin carried was still warm when Reeves found it later, which means it couldn't have been extinguished long. But when the villagers arrived, the graveyard was nearly dark. Someone put out that light, someone who wanted confusion. The vicar stepped forward, his voice hesitant. You mean someone besides the boy? Miss Marple turned her calm gaze on him. Yes, Reverend, the same someone who planted the walking stick where it would be found, and who took the trouble to type a note, ensuring Mr. Pembroke would stand at the grave that night. A man clever enough to play puppeteer with both guilt and virtue. The color drained from his cheeks. You can't possibly think. Oh, but I do, she said gently. When you discovered those letters, you saw an opportunity to remind your congregation of sin and repentance without ever confessing your own. You encouraged Mr. Pembroke's theatrics, knowing what kind of man he was, vain, moralizing, and easily led. You thought a public scandal would make an example of him, not kill him. But when he fell, you realized your part in the affair could never withstand scrutiny. So you buried it all again quite literally by planting that stick and muddying the timeline. Nash's head snapped up. The vicar? But he's a man of God. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Even shepherds lose their way, Mr. Nash. The Reverend did not kill Mr. Pembroke, but he did everything else to ensure the truth was buried beneath a more convenient story. He sent anonymous notes, he typed threats, and when blood was spilled, he tampered with the scene to make it look simple. A tragic quarrel, a boy's mistake, nothing more. The vicar's hands trembled against the edge of the desk. You have no proof. On the contrary, she said quietly. The typewriter ribbon. It holds the impression of every letter you struck. Reeves will find the words, by order of. Still faintly pressed into it, the same phrase on the torn parchment Mr. Pembroke clutched. You typed that, too, to make the document look older, to tie his death to the old grave's legend. You used God's mystery to disguise your own. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then the vicar sank into the chair, his composure collapsing like a house of cards. He was destroying her, Miss Marple. Margaret came to me in tears that morning, told me he meant to humiliate her. I thought to frighten him, to make him repent his cruelty. I thought if I used the superstition of the forbidden grave, he'd think twice before going through with his plans. I didn't mean for anyone to die. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her tone remained firm. Intention and consequence seldom walk hand in hand, Reverend. Evil rarely begins with malice, it begins with justification. He bowed his head, whispering, I'll tell Reeves everything. Yes, she said, that would be wise, but remember truth. Once spoken, cannot be managed like a sermon. It has a way of spreading, quietly, but completely. Outside, the rain eased to a fine mist, and the sound of Reeves's returning boots echoed along the garden path. The vicar stared into the fire, its light glinting off the typewriter's keys. Nash rose heavily, muttering that he'd fetch Reeves in. When the door closed, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, and candle wax the scent of endings. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and looked once more at the machine that had woven so much deception from the press of its keys. Men, she said softly to no one, are always so certain they can master guilt by dressing it in righteousness. But guilt, I find, has a longer memory than any of us. And as the constable's voice carried in from the hall, Miss Marple turned toward the window where dawn was beginning to break, a pale, cold light washing the gravestones clean. The forbidden grave, at last, had given up its secret. The dawn crept slowly across Mary Mead, soft and grey, drawing a fragile stillness over the village that had not slept. A faint mist still hovered above the churchyard, curling around the headstones like reluctant ghosts unwilling to leave. Miss Marple stood by her garden gate, a shawl around her shoulders, watching Constable Reeves lead the vicar toward the waiting carriage. No one spoke. Only the rhythmic clatter of boots on wet cobblestones broke the silence. Reeves paused to tip his hat toward her, a gesture of respect tinged with exhaustion, before climbing aboard. The door shut, and the wheels rolled away through the morning fog. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction, only a quiet melancholy. She had seen justice before, in many forms, and it never looked the same twice. It was rarely clean, never whole, and always left a residue like ash in the corners of one's mind. She turned and went inside. The kettle was already whistling softly on the stove, as though it had been waiting for her. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window overlooking the lane, where a few villagers were already gathering in subdued knots, whispering beneath umbrellas. Their words drifted faintly through the glass. The vicar. Imagine that. Poor Mrs. Pembroke. That young lad, Martin. Such a pity. Gossip, like smoke, could never truly be contained. A light tap came at her door. When she opened it, Mrs. Pembroke stood there, veiled, pale, and trembling. She looked like a woman caught between grief and relief, uncertain which deserved her first. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I don't know how to thank you. The constable told me everything." Miss Marple gestured her in kindly. "There's no need to thank me, my dear. Sit down. You've had a dreadful ordeal." Mrs. Pembroke obeyed, lowering herself onto the settee. Her hands twisted the edge of her gloves. "He never meant to hurt anyone, you know, the vicar, I mean. He said I'd disgraced his name, that he'd see everyone know it. I begged him to stop, but he wouldn't." Her voice faltered. The vicar thought if he frightened him, it might humble him. But instead, it brought this. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, good intentions have a way of opening very dark doors, and love is rarely wise when pride is involved." Mrs. Pembroke's eyes filled with tears. "And Martin, they're saying he'll be charged, that the law must do its part." Miss Marple interrupted softly. "But I believe Reeves will see to it that mercy has a say as well. His act was impulsive, not wicked. That distinction matters more than people think." The widow nodded, her tears falling freely now. "If only I had stopped it all, if I'd burned those letters when I first found them." Miss Marple set down her cup, her tone thoughtful. "Perhaps, but destruction doesn't always erase the truth. It only delays its discovery. Your husband's cruelty, the vicar's deceit, the boy's misguided loyalty, they were all roots of the same weed, growing from years of silence. Silence, I've learned, is the most dangerous accomplice of all." Mrs. Pembroke looked up, startled. "You make it sound as though I'm to blame." Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile. "My dear, blame is a luxury none of us can afford. I only mean that none of us live in isolation. We all feed one another's fates, whether by word or by quiet omission." For a while, neither spoke. The clock ticked gently on the mantel, and outside, the mist began to lift. When at last Mrs. Pembroke rose to leave, her expression was calmer, though her eyes still carried the weight of something unfinished. "Will they hang him?" she whispered suddenly, hand on the doorknob. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, I don't think so. The court will see the truth, and even the hardest hearts in authority tend to soften when faced with youthful folly and a cruel provocation. But punishment will come in its own form. That boy will live with the memory all his life, and that is the heaviest sentence of all." Mrs. Pembroke pressed her hand briefly over Miss Marple's, murmured a word of gratitude, and disappeared into the brightening morning. Left alone, Miss Marple tidied the tea things, her movements slow and deliberate. The little cottage, so often filled with stillness, now seemed to hum with echoes of the past night, the lantern's glint, the cry in the dark, the rustle of rain on graves. She thought of Nash, tending his father's resting place with unspoken loyalty, of the vicar, whose righteousness had curdled into manipulation, of young Martin, whose impulsive act had turned a page of history soaked in love, shame, and superstition. As she stepped out into the garden, the air smelled of wet leaves and candle smoke from the church, still burning low. Life was already returning to its familiar rhythm. The grocer's cart clattered by, and children hurried down the lane toward the schoolhouse, their laughter a small defiance against the weight of tragedy. Miss Marple paused by her roses, brushing raindrops from the petals. They gleamed pink against the grey sky, fragile but persistent. "It's always the same," she murmured quietly to herself. A little pride, a little fear, and a great deal of misunderstanding, and the whole village turned upside down. Then she smiled faintly, as though at some private recollection, and went back inside. On her table lay a single, unopened letter, delivered earlier that morning. It bore the handwriting of Inspector Craddock from Scotland Yard. She picked it up, read the neat signature with an amused sigh, and whispered, "Ah, well, I suppose peace never lasts long in Mary Mead." She placed the letter beside her knitting, refilled her teacup, and settled once more by the window, watching, listening, and waiting, as all true observers of human nature do. The letter from Inspector Craddock remained unopened on Miss Marple's table for nearly an hour. She could not bring herself to break the seal at once. Instead, she poured another cup of tea, and sat in quiet contemplation, letting the faint crackle of the hearth fill the room. The case at St. Luke's had closed, at least officially. But something within her refused to rest. The village had already begun to return to its rhythm, yet a strange unease lingered in the air, as though some part of the truth still hovered just out of reach. Miss Marple had learned, through long years of human observation, that when people rush to forget, it is almost always because they fear remembering. At last, she took up the envelope and slit it open neatly with her embroidery scissors. The letter was brief, written in Craddock's brisk, professional hand. "My dear Miss Marple, word has reached us about the unfortunate matter in Mary Mead. I gather the local constable handled it admirably with, no doubt, your guiding influence behind the scenes. There is, however, one detail I should like your opinion on. The post-mortem revealed that Mr. Pembroke's injuries were inflicted from behind at an angle inconsistent with the lantern strike described. It suggests a shorter assailant or someone kneeling. The report will, of course, remain sealed pending the magistrate's review, but I thought it curious enough to merit your reflection. Yours, as ever, A. Craddock." Miss Marple read the letter twice, her pale eyes narrowing slightly. A shorter assailant or someone kneeling. She rose, her cup forgotten. That small phrase shifted everything she had accepted as concluded. It was not Martin who had delivered the fatal blow. After all, his strike had stunned, not killed. The second blow had been deliberate and cold, the kind of act that required both precision and proximity. "Kneeling," Craddock had said. Who would kneel beside a dying man but someone who claimed to grieve him? By mid-morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the lanes slick and glistening. Miss Marple made her way toward the churchyard, moving with purpose but without haste. The gates stood open, and the grass shone darkly beneath the returning Sunday. Reeves was there, speaking with one of his men near the vestry door. When he saw her, he smiled, though the lines of fatigue were still deep about his mouth. "Morning, Miss Marple. You'll be glad to know the village has quieted down. Mrs. Pembroke's left for Eastbourne to stay with a cousin." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "So I heard. And young Martin, he's to be held till the inquest. But I doubt the magistrate will be too harsh. Poor lad's broken by it all." She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the forbidden grave, where the soil had already been leveled again. "Tell me, Constable, who supervised the removal of Mr. Pembroke's body?" "Dr. Ellis and myself," he said. Mrs. Pembroke was there for a moment, but she fainted before the coroner arrived. We sent her home. Ah, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. And afterward, did she return? Reeves frowned. No, not that I recall. Miss Marple smiled gently, though her thoughts were racing. I expect you've done everything quite properly, Constable. Still, there's a small matter I'd like to confirm. You wouldn't happen to have the lantern Martin used that night? It's in the evidence box at the station. Why? Because, she said, I'd like to see how high a man must lift it to reach the wound you described. It's a curious thing. Scale. He blinked, puzzled, but nodded. You think there's something we missed? Not missed, she said softly. Merely misunderstood. By the time she left the station, her suspicions had hardened into certainty. The lantern's rim, when raised by a youth of Martin's height, would have struck the side of the head, not the back. The fatal wound had come from a lower angle altogether. Miss Marple walked slowly home, the path brightening with each step, though her mood darkened. At her gate, she found a letter lying where the postman had dropped it. The handwriting was feminine, elegant Mrs. Pembroke's. Inside was a single sheet, written in hurried script. Miss Marple, I am leaving Mary Mead for good. I cannot bear to stay among so many memories. Please believe I am grateful for your kindness, though you must not try to find me. What's done cannot be undone. Miss Marple read the note twice, her lips tightening. The phrasing was too deliberate, too carefully sorrowful. It was a confession dressed as farewell. She folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. That evening, she returned once more to the churchyard. The moon was rising, and the grass glistened with dew. She stood before the forbidden grave, her breath visible in the chill air. The iron cross loomed dark above her. He was kneeling, she whispered. Kneeling, not struck from behind. That means the killer was beside him, someone he trusted, someone close enough to touch his hand as he died. She knelt then, pressing her palm lightly to the damp soil. You pitied him, didn't you, my dear? Pitied him even as you silenced him. He would have ruined you, yes, but perhaps more than that. He would have exposed that you loved another. You had to stop him, and when you saw the boy's blow had not finished the work, you did what desperation demanded. It was mercy, of a sort. A soft breeze stirred the leaves, and Miss Marple rose, her decision made. In the morning she would write to Craddock only a short note, enough to correct the record. Martin Blythe would be exonerated in time, though Mrs. Pembroke would never face a courtroom. Some truths, Miss Marple thought, must be left to God, who is patient with sinners and discreet with the dead. She turned toward the lane, her silhouette small and steady against the moonlit stones. Behind her, the graveyard settled once more into silence, the iron cross gleaming faintly as though satisfied that its secret, finally, had been understood. Morning light seeped gently across Mary Mead, painting the thatched roofs in pale gold. The mist had burned away, and with it, the last of the night's secrets seemed ready to vanish, though Miss Marple knew that secrets never truly disappeared. They only settled deeper, like roots under the soil, waiting for the right season to bloom again. She sat at her writing desk, her pen gliding steadily across thick paper. The letter to Inspector Craddock was brief, yet every word was weighted with precision. She explained what the post-mortem had revealed, the height and angle of the fatal wound, and how such a blow could only have been struck by someone kneeling beside the victim. She added nothing more than was necessary. She did not name Mrs. Pembroke. She merely suggested that the constable reconsider the assumption of intent. When she sealed the envelope, she felt neither satisfaction nor doubt, only the quiet fatigue that came from knowing too much about human frailty. The village, in its way, had already begun its slow process of forgetting. The baker's window once again displayed neat rows of currant buns instead of whispered theories, and the postmistress no longer paused before handing out letters as though they might explode. People needed to move on, and they would. They always did. Yet, as Miss Marple stepped outside to post her letter, she sensed an unease that even time could not fully wash away. Evil, she often reflected, did not linger in the grand or the grotesque. It hid itself best in ordinary lives. On her way back, she passed the churchyard, where Constable Reeves stood with 2 workmen. They were repairing the stone wall that bordered the lane. Reeves waved when he saw her, his face drawn but resolute. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called. "We've just had word Martin Blythe's to be released today. The magistrates reviewed your notes and Craddock's findings. Seems the boy's conscience did him more harm than any court could." "I'm very glad to hear it," she replied gently. "He'll need kindness now, not questions." Reeves nodded. "I'll see to it. As for Mrs. Pembroke," he hesitated. "They've no intention of pursuing her. She's left no forwarding address." "Best that way," Miss Marple said softly. "A woman who's lost everything has no need for punishment, only peace." As she turned to leave, Reeves frowned slightly. "Strange thing, though. The gardener found something this morning while digging near the yews, a ring. Gold, with initials inside, E, N, and M. Thought you might make sense of it." Miss Marple took the small object from his hand. The engraving had faded with age, but she recognized the initials at once. Edward Nash and Margaret Hartwell, the names from the letters, the lovers who had begun this tragedy decades before. The ring was their promise, lost, buried, then unearthed in the very soil where their secret had been hidden. She traced the worn engraving with her thumb, her heart tightening. "Perhaps it's only fitting," she murmured. "After all, they've both had their peace disturbed. It's time they rested together at last." Reeves, who never quite followed her riddles, nodded uncertainly. "Shall I hand it over to the vicarage for safekeeping?" Miss Marple looked toward the church. The vicarage windows were shuttered, empty now, the air around them still heavy with what had passed. "No," she said. "Better not. Let me see to it." That evening, when twilight fell and the churchyard was quiet once more, Miss Marple returned alone. The grass was soft beneath her feet, and the scent of damp earth rose like memory. She knelt by the forbidden grave, the iron cross cold beneath her fingertips. Carefully, she placed the ring at its base, pressing it into the soil until it vanished. "You see," she whispered, "even in the darkest tales, love leaves its mark. Sometimes it destroys, sometimes it redeems, but it always remembers." She remained there for a long while, listening to the faint rustle of wind through the yew branches, the distant echo of the evening bell. For the first time in days, her thoughts felt still. When she finally stood, she noticed a figure watching from the edge of the churchyard, Martin Blythe, pale but freer somehow, as though a shadow had lifted from his young face. He stepped forward hesitantly. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "They told me I was free, but I don't feel it." She regarded him kindly. "Freedom is seldom a feeling, my dear. It's more a duty to live rightly after one has been wrong. That's the harder task." He nodded, eyes glistening. "I thought I was protecting her. I thought it was love." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Love can make saints of us or sinners. The trick is knowing which before it's too late." He looked down, his hands trembling slightly. "Will they ever forgive me?" "Perhaps not all," she said, "but life has a way of forgiving those who learn." She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Go home, Martin. Help Mr. Nash with the gardens. There's much to be tended before the next season." As he walked away into the fading light, Miss Marple watched him until he vanished down the lane. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of rain and earth, and somewhere a church bell tolled the hour. She looked once more at the grave and thought how strange it was that human lives so brief and fragile could weave such long shadows. Then, with a quiet sigh, she turned back toward her cottage, where the lamp glowed warmly in the window, a small promise against the encroaching night.